The Grand Sheila Gala didn't host guests, it showcased prey. Walls of seamless glass looked out over a Seoul skyline that pulsed like a neon heartbeat, hiding the jagged teeth of the underworld beneath layers of chrome and light. In the shadows of the ballroom, men with ink beneath their silk sleeves watched the crowd with predatory stillness. This was a playground for the Saeroun syndicate, a dynasty built on high-frequency trading and silent executions. Janae Jevonte moved through the shimmering crowd like a splash of ink on white silk. Her evening gown was a masterpiece of borrowed elegance, her heels clicking against the marble with a confidence that masked a hollow stomach. She'd agreed to this charade for a payout that would finally stop the debt collectors from circling her apartment like sharks. The agency's instructions had been crystalline. Smile. Don't ask names. Be the perfect distraction for the man on your arm. Never look too closely at the tattoos peeking from a guest's collar. Never linger near the closed doors of the VIP suites. But Janae was about to learn that in a city of monsters, a fake date is just another word for bait. Her companion, a man with eyes like polished obsidian and a dragon coiling up his neck, leaned in close and whispered a command that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with survival. Before we continue this story, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these stories to life. The Grand Sheila Gala hummed with the sound of thousands of dollars in champagne being poured into lead crystal. Janae Jevonte smoothed the silk of her emerald gown, her fingers grazing the hidden pocket where she kept her emergency passport and a stack of won. She had been in Seoul long enough to know that a smile was a woman's best armor, especially when she was playing the part of a high society trophy for a man she had only met an hour ago. The lobby was a cathedral of light, dominated by a waterfall that cascaded down 3 stories of black granite. It was beautiful, but to Janae, it felt like a gilded trap. She looked for her date, a man she knew only as Mr. Kang, who had promised her 5 million won just to stand by his side and look enamored. When he finally stepped out of the elevator, the atmosphere in the room didn't just shift, it curdled. The chatter died down to a reverent whisper, and the sea of tuxedo-clad executives parted like water before a shark. Kang Do-Hwan didn't walk, he reclaimed space. He was dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that looked like it had been molded to his frame, but it was the ink that stole Janae's breath. A dark, intricate dragon's tail curled around the side of his neck, disappearing into the crisp white collar of his shirt, a mark of the Saeroun syndicate. He stopped in front of her, his eyes like polished obsidian, devoid of the warmth one usually found in a date. Up close, he radiated a lethal gravity that made her heels feel suddenly unsteady. He didn't offer a polite greeting. He simply reached out and took her hand, his rings cold against her skin. "You look exactly like the distraction I need," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "Distraction?" Janae whispered, her heart beginning a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "The agency said this was just a corporate mixer." Do-Hwan tilted his head, the dragon on his neck appearing to shift as he moved. A faint, razor-thin scar ran through his eyebrow, the only blemish on a face of terrifying perfection. "The agency lied to you, Janae. This isn't a mixer, it's an audit, and you are the only thing keeping these men from realizing I've already decided which of them dies tonight." He tucked her arm into his grip firm and possessive. As they walked toward the ballroom, Janae caught the sight of 4 men in identical gray suits flanking them, their hands hovering near their waistbands. She realized then that the fake date wasn't a job, it was an initiation. She wasn't standing next to a businessman, she was tethered to the city's most dangerous predator, and the entire room was watching them through the crosshairs of a legacy she didn't understand. The ballroom was a blur of spinning silk and forced laughter, until the moment the world went silent. It happened during the first toast. Do-Hwan stood with a glass of vintage champagne, the light from the chandeliers catching the silver watch on his wrist. When Janae saw it, a tiny dancing spark of crimson light reflecting off the rim of his flute. It wasn't a camera flash, it was a kill shot. "Down!" Janae screamed, her voice tearing through the refined atmosphere. She didn't think. She lunged, her weight slamming into Do-Hwan's chest just as the reinforced glass of the north window imploded. The sound was a tectonic shift, a deafening crack that rained diamond-sharp shards over the screaming elite. A high-velocity round whizzed through the space where Do-Hwan's head had been a millisecond before, punching a jagged hole into a marble pillar. "Protect the asset," a voice roared over the chaos. Before Janae could catch her breath, she was hoisted upward by two of the gray-suited enforcers. They didn't move like men, they moved like machines. Do-Hwan was already on his feet, his face a mask of frozen rage, a small cut on his cheek bleeding a single dark ruby onto his white collar. He didn't look scared, he looked insulted. "Go, go, go!" They were swept into a frantic sprint through the service corridors, the sounds of panicked guests and secondary gunfire fading behind heavy fire doors. Janae's heels were useless on the industrial flooring. She kicked them off, her bare feet hitting the cold concrete as they reached the loading bay. Waiting in the shadows was a black limousine that looked more like an urban tank than a luxury vehicle. The doors didn't swing, they hissed open with the weight of reinforced steel. Janae was shoved into the plush leather interior, followed immediately by Do-Hwan. The doors slammed shut with a vacuum-sealed thud, instantly silencing the sirens and screams of the outside world. The driver floored it, the tires screeching as the heavy car lurched forward, drifting out of the garage and into the neon veins of the city. Janae sat huddled in the corner, her emerald dress torn and her hair a wild mess of silk. She looked at Do-Hwan, who was calmly adjusting his cufflinks as if they hadn't just dodged a burial. "You saw the laser," he said, his eyes fixating on her with a terrifying new intensity. "Most civilians look at the lights. You looked at the source. Who are you, Janae?" "I'm a girl who wants her 5 million won and a plane ticket home," she rasped, her hand shaking as she clutched the leather seat. Do-Hwan leaned forward, his shadow engulfing her. The dragon on his neck seemed to pulse in the flickering light of the street lamps passing overhead. "The money is yours, but the ticket is canceled. You just saved the King of Seoul. That makes you a target, and in this city, there is only one place safe from the people who want me dead." He gestured to the fortified walls of the car. "You're in the web now, and I don't let my treasures go." The transition from the armored hum of the limousine to the absolute silence of the penthouse was jarring. Janae awoke to a room that felt less like a bedroom and more like a gallery of cold, modern art. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of Seoul's neon arteries, but as she approached the window, she saw the faint, telltale shimmer of a high-frequency acoustic jammer and ballistic mesh. She was 60 stories up, suspended in a cloud of marble and obsidian, yet the air felt impossibly heavy. Pushing back the silk sheets, she found a fresh wardrobe waiting for her, minimalist, expensive, and entirely devoid of the emerald silk she'd worn to the gala. She was being rebranded, scrubbed of her previous life to fit the aesthetic of a ghost. She moved towards the heavy door, but it didn't have a handle, only a sleek biometric scanner that glowed a soft, dismissive red when she approached. The realization settled in her gut like lead. The elevator required a code she didn't have, and the windows were unbreakable. She was safe, yes, but she was also a specimen in a jar. "The breakfast is at the table. It is balanced for someone under extreme stress." Do-Hwan stood by the kitchen island, his charcoal suit jacket gone, his white sleeves rolled up to reveal the full, violent beauty of the dragon coiling down his forearm. He was slicing an apple with a paring knife that looked sharp enough to split a hair. He didn't look up as she entered, but his focus was entirely on her. "I can't stay here," Janae said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The deal was one night. I did my job. I saved your life. Let me go." "I cannot let you go, because the man who hired the sniper is currently watching your apartment," Do-Hwan replied, finally lifting his gaze. His eyes were tired, but the lethal edge remained. "If you walk out of that door, you won't make it to the subway." He slid a tablet across the marble counter. It showed a grainy, real-time feed of her street in Itaewon. A black sedan was idling at the curb, and two men she didn't recognize were standing by her front buzzer. "You are the only variable the trader didn't account for, Janae," Do-Hwan said, stepping closer until she could smell the cedar wood on his skin. "You are my leverage. Until I find the leak in my own house, you stay in the cage. I will provide everything you need, except the exit." Janae looked from the screen to the man. She was trapped between a killer at her door and a king in her kitchen. "And if I refuse to play along?" "Then you die in a gutter instead of a palace," he said simply. "Eat your breakfast. We have work to do." The penthouse was a tomb of glass, the morning light doing little to warm the cold, minimalist interior. Do-Hwan didn't sit. He leaned against the marble island, watching Janae with the stillness of a man who had spent his life reading the tells of liars. He set the paring knife down with a soft, final clink. "Most expats in Seoul come here to teach English or work for Samsung. Do-Hwan began, his voice dropping into a dangerous, inquisitive register. They see a red light on a balcony and think it's a security sensor. You recognized it as a 7.62mm laser sight. You didn't scream. You moved. You knew the trajectory before the glass even broke. He stepped toward her, his presence expanding until the room felt claustrophobic. He reached out, his thumb grazing the edge of her jaw, forcing her to look up. His eyes searched hers, not for affection, but for the truth hidden in the iris. The agency profile said you were a failed entrepreneur with a business degree, but businesses don't teach you how to spot a Dragunov in a crowded ballroom. Janae didn't flinch. She had spent years perfecting the art of the blank stare. I lived in a neighborhood back home where you learned to look at roofs before you looked at the street. It's called survival, Do-Hwan. Not everyone has a wall of enforcers to do it for them. Do-Hwan's eyes narrowed. He grabbed her hand, turning it palm up. He traced the faint, jagged scar between her thumb and forefinger, a mark of a blade, old and faded. This wasn't a kitchen accident. And your gait? You walk like someone who's used to carrying a weight on their hip. You're not just a girl in a dress. You're a ghost with a past that smells like cordite. He leaned in, his breath hot against her ear, the dragon on his neck appearing to coil tighter in the shadows. Who were you before you came to my city? A soldier? A runner? Tell me the truth, and I might give you a weapon. Lie to me, and you'll remain a bird in a cage. Janae pulled her hand away, her heart hammering but her voice like ice. I was someone who decided that being a victim was a choice I'd never make again. If you want to find your traitor, stop looking at my scars and start looking at your own shadow. I'm the only one in this house who isn't on your payroll. That makes me the only one you can actually trust. Do-Hwan laughed, a dry, mirthless sound that didn't reach his eyes. For the first time, the suspicion in his gaze was replaced by a dark, shimmering curiosity. He realized he hadn't just captured a witness. He had invited a strategist into his fortress. Then prove it, he whispered. The leak is in the Saeroun's financial arm. Use that business degree of yours. Find the man who tried to kill us, and I might just let you keep your wings.
The tablet Do-Hwan handed Janae was cold, a sleek slab of encrypted secrets that felt heavier than the armored glass of the penthouse. He left her alone in the study, a room that smelled of old paper and new power, but she knew the cameras were tracking the movement of her eyes. She sat at the desk, the digital glow reflecting in her pupils as she began to tear through the Saeroun's financial architecture. It wasn't just a business degree that allowed her to see the patterns. It was the years she'd spent in the gray markets of Detroit, learning how money breathed when it was trying to stay hidden. The ledger was disguised as a series of legitimate logistics shipments for a semiconductor firm, but the shipping weights were impossible. 500 kilograms of silicon wafers moving to a dock in Incheon that didn't exist. Janae's fingers flew across the screen. She didn't just look at the numbers, she looked at the syntax of the notes. They were written in a high-level corporate Korean, but periodically a specific dialectal slang slipped through. Words like kari, a Busan-specific term for something slick or cool. It was a linguistic fingerprint. She cross-referenced the transaction timestamps with Do-Hwan's personal calendar. Every time a ghost shipment was authorized, Do-Hwan was in a secure meeting. Only one person had the clearance to sign off on logistics while the boss was off the grid. Only one person was a native of the Busan docks. "Found you," she whispered, her blood running cold. The door hissed open. Do-Hwan entered, his tie loosened, the dragon on his neck partially obscured by the shadow of his jaw. "You've been staring at that screen for 3 hours, Janae. Do you have a name, or are you just admiring the math?" Janae turned the tablet toward him. She highlighted the Kadi annotations and the redirected funds flowing into a private trust in the Cayman Islands. "Your traitor isn't a rival gang leader or a bitter enforcer, Do-Hwan. It's the man who keeps your schedule." Do-Hwan froze. He looked at the data, his expression shifting from a cold mask to a jagged fracture of pure, silent shock. He didn't need to read the name on the account. He recognized the signature. "Ji-Yoon," he breathed, the name sounding like a death rattle. "My conciliar. He was with me when we took the docks. He's the one who vetted the security for the gala." "He didn't just vet it, Do-Hwan." She stood up to meet his gaze. "He sold the timing. He knew exactly when you'd be holding that glass. He's not just stealing your money, Do-Hwan. He's clearing the throne so he can sit in it." The silence in the room became a physical weight. Do-Hwan's hand tightened around the edge of the desk until the wood groaned. The betrayal wasn't just a business loss. It was a severing of his last tie to loyalty. He looked at Janae, and for the first time, he didn't see a captive. He saw his only ally. The transition from the sterile silence of the penthouse to the sensory assault of the Gilded Talon was like stepping into a fever dream. Located 4 stories beneath a nondescript luxury spa in Gangnam, the underground casino was a cavern of gold leaf, cigarette smoke, and the desperate energy of men with too much to lose. Janae walked a half step behind Do-Hwan, her body draped in a gown of liquid gold that clung to her like a second skin. She wasn't just a date anymore. She was the mafia queen, the glamorous distraction designed to keep every eye in the room, especially Ji-hoon's, away from the silent execution of a counter-coup. "Remember," Do-Hwan murmured, his hand a heavy, warm weight on the small of her back. "You aren't watching the cards. You are watching the room. If Ji-hoon moves toward the private salon, you initiate the scene." They reached the high-limits baccarat table where Ji-hoon sat, looking every bit the loyal advisor in a silver suit. He looked up, his eyes widening for a fraction of a second as he saw Janae. He expected her to be a terrified captive. Instead, she offered him a slow, predatory smile that she had practiced in the penthouse mirrors. She took her seat beside Do-Hwan, leaning in to whisper in his ear with an intimacy that suggested she was privy to every secret he held. Janae's pulse thrummed in her ears, but her hands were steady as she reached for a stack of black chips. Across the table, Ji-hoon's composure was beginning to fray. He kept glancing at his watch, then at the security detail near the velvet curtains. He was waiting for a signal that would never come, unaware that Janae had already redirected the casino's internal server to a dead-end loop. "You seem distracted, Ji-hoon," Do-Hwan said, his voice as smooth as aged whiskey. "Perhaps the stakes are getting too high for you?" Janae chose that moment to play her part. She laughed, a bright, melodic sound that drew the attention of every gambler at the table, and intentionally tipped her champagne glass. The crystal shattered against the edge of the mahogany, the golden liquid spilling over Ji-hoon's sleeve. "Oh, how clumsy of me," she gasped, standing up and reaching for his arm with a silk napkin. As she leaned in, her eyes locked onto his, and she saw the sharp flash of panic. Under the table, she felt Do-Hwan's hand move toward his jacket. The distraction worked. The enforcers in the room shifted their focus to the spill, leaving the path to the private salon unguarded. Ji-hoon pulled away, his face pale, but the trap had already snapped shut. He was no longer the hunter. He was a man surrounded by ghosts in a room made of gold. The golden doors of the private salon clicked shut, sealing out the frantic bells of the slot machines and the muffled roar of the casino floor. The air here was thin, heavy with the scent of expensive incense and the metallic tang of impending violence. Ji-hoon stood near the lacquer liquor cabinet, his hands trembling as he tried to blot the champagne stain on his cuff. But he wasn't looking at Do-Hwan. His terrified gaze was fixed on the figure sitting in the high-backed velvet chair at the far end of the room, a man whose face was a softer, younger mirror of the boss's own. Do-Hwan breathed, the name sounding more like a curse than a greeting. Janae felt the temperature in the room drop. She stood by the door, her gold gown shimmering like a warning light. She had expected a rival, a disgruntled lieutenant, or even the foreign cartel. She hadn't expected the betrayal to come from the same bloodline. Minho, Do-Hwan's younger brother, took a slow sip of cognac, his expression one of bored resentment rather than guilt. "You always did have a dramatic flair, brother," Minho said, his voice lackadaisical. "Bringing a pretty American to my favorite haunt just to catch me in a lie? It's beneath you." Do-Hwan walked toward the center of the room, his movements stiff, as if he were holding his own soul together by sheer force of will. He ignored Ji-hoon entirely. The advisor was just a tool. The hand wielding it was his own flesh and blood. "I gave you the logistics arm. I gave you a seat at the table. I gave you my trust when the council wanted you dead. Why, Minho? Because you gave me everything except the one thing I wanted, the crown," Minho snapped, the boredom vanishing into a raw, ugly envy. "You want to turn the Saeroun into a legitimate shipping company. You want to go white. But white is boring. White doesn't have the power of the old ways. Ji-hoon and I, we want to keep the teeth." Do-Hwan stopped inches from his brother. The dragon on his neck seemed to darken, the ink pulsing with the rapid beat of his heart. For a moment, the lethal dawn was gone, replaced by a man looking at the ruin of his family. "You hired the sniper. You sat at my table, drank my wine, and waited for my head to explode across the ballroom. Business is business, Do-Hwan. You taught me that," Minho sneered. Janae watched as Do-Hwan's hand slowly reached for the weapon tucked into his waistband. The emotional toll was written in the sudden, deep lines around his mouth. This wasn't a tactical victory. It was an execution of his own heart. "Business is finished," Do-Hwan whispered. He didn't look back at Janae, but his voice was a plea for her to look away. "Ji-hoon, leave us. I need to speak with my brother one last time."
The engagement party was supposed to be the final veil, a high-altitude masquerade atop the Lotte World Tower meant to solidify Do-Hwan's return to power. Instead, it became a kill box. The rooftop garden, lush with cherry blossoms and shielded by a glass dome, shattered as Minho's contingency plan arrived in a roar of rotor blades. 2 unmarked black helicopters hovered like vultures against the Seoul skyline, their searchlights blinding the panicked guests before the sliding doors opened to unleash a storm of lead. The glass dome disintegrated, raining crystal daggers onto the white-clothed tables. "Janae, get down!" Do-Hwan roared, shoving her behind a heavy stone planter. He was a shadow in motion, his tuxedo jacket discarded as he drew his custom-grip firearm, returning fire with a precision that defied the chaos. But even a King of Seoul could be overwhelmed. A flashbang grenade skidded across the marble, detonating in a blinding white roar that sent Do-Hwan staggering, his weapon spinning across the floor into the shadows near Janae's feet. Through the ringing in her ears, Janae saw Minho's tactical team rappelling onto the deck. One soldier, a mountain of a man in a balaclava, leveled his rifle at the dazed Do-Hwan. Time slowed to a crawl. The fake fiancé was gone. The survivor from the streets of Detroit took her place. Janae lunged from the shadows, her fingers closing around the cold, textured grip of Do-Hwan's pistol. It was heavy, balanced for a killer, but it felt familiar in her palm. She didn't hesitate. She remembered the rooflines of her youth, the way a target moved before it struck. She raised the weapon, bracing her wrist as she squeezed the trigger. The recoil punched through her arm, but the soldier collapsed before he could fire a single round. Janae didn't stop. She moved with a fluid, lethal grace, suppressed rounds thudding into the stone pillars as she provided cover for Do-Hwan to regain his footing. Do-Hwan looked at her, really looked at her, as he scrambled back to her side. There was no suspicion left in his eyes, only a fierce, burning pride. He placed his hand over hers on the grip, their pulses sinking in the heat of the firefight. "You're a hell of a distraction, Janae," he gritted out, his voice a jagged edge of adrenaline. "Less talking, more shooting," she snapped back, ejecting the spent magazine and slamming in a fresh one with a mechanical click. Together they turned toward the remaining intruders, 2 ghosts against the city lights, no longer a boss and a captive, but a unified front in a war for their lives. The sirens of the Seoul Metropolitan Police began to wail in the canyons of Gangnam far below, but on the roof of the Lotte World Tower, the air had gone unnervingly still. The smell of ozone and cherry blossoms hung heavy over the wreckage of the dome. Minho was gone, taken into the shadows by the enforcers who remained loyal to the crown, and the helicopters had retreated into the smog-choked horizon. Do-Hwan stood by the edge of the helipad, his white shirt stained with oil and his brother's betrayal. He looked down at his hands that had spent a lifetime clutching at a throne made of glass. And then he looked at Janae. She was still holding his weapon, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the entrance, as if waiting for the next ghost to appear. "It's over, Janae," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He walked to her, gently easing the pistol from her grip and tucking it away. "The Saeroun, as you knew it, died tonight. My brother took the violence with him." 3 days later, the golden cage was gone. Janae stood in the center of the penthouse, her bags packed. On the mahogany table lay a set of documents, a clean criminal record, a newly minted business license in her name, and a bank draft that was triple the original 5 million won. He had cleared her path, scrubbing her involvement from every police report and security feed in the city. She was free. "You're late for your flight," Do-Hwan said, stepping out onto the balcony. He wasn't wearing a suit. In a simple black sweater, he looked less like a deity of the underworld and more like a man. "I'm not going," Janae replied, turning to face him. She held up the business license. "You want to turn this empire white. You want to move into legitimate logistics and tech. But you don't know how to run a clean business, Do-Hwan. You only know how to rule a dirty one." Do-Hwan smiled, a real, slow smile that reached his obsidian eyes. He walked toward her, stopping just inches away, the dragon on his neck finally still. "I was hoping you'd say that. I don't need a distraction anymore, Janae. I need a partner. Someone who isn't afraid to look at the roof before the street." He held out a hand, not as a shackle,
but as an invitation. The Saeroun name is being retired. We're building something new, something legal, but it's going to be a war of a different kind. Janae looked at his hand, then at the city she had finally conquered. She took it, her grip firm and equal. The masquerade was over, and the real danger was just beginning. But for the first time in Seoul, she wasn't running. She was leading.